This is the medical floor where most of the inmates stay. You got 2 orderlies that live on site, so don't hesitate to wake them up. There's usually about 10 to 20 regulars in here, and TV pretty much stays on 24/7. I nodded politely, but in reality, the next 90 days couldn't go by fast enough. The station looks out over the floor, so you pretty much just sit here and observe. Some of the old guys get a little snappish, but they're pretty chill most of the time. Officer Dorrington looked like he had fallen right out of a flower child commune and discovered that he had bills to pay and ethics to violate in the process. His hair was longer than advised. His eyes had a red tint to them that made me think he might be permanently stoned, and he talked like a basset hound giving a dissertation. He was perfect for the infirmary, a place where nothing ever happened, but it was no wonder they kept him off the compound. And of course, these monitors help you watch the show cells. There are only 2 that are occupied right now, Cell 1 and Cell 12. We usually try to fill them up from 1 to 12, but the guy in 12's been there for a little bit. He's squirrely, so if you have to open that door for any reason, make sure you got some backup. I nodded, not really paying attention, as I told him I thought I could handle it. Okay, brother, keep it chill, relax. This is the best post you'll ever sit. He offered me a fist, and I bumped it half-heartedly as he headed out. I sighed as I took the chair behind the pane of one-way glass that separated my office from the infirmary floor. I thought at the time that this was going to be the most boring 3 months of my life. Turned out I couldn't have known how wrong I would be. I'd worked at Stragview for about 5 years before I had my first really bad use of force. Happens to everyone eventually, and I'd been luckier than most in that respect. I had been working in the high custody dorm since I graduated, and my career has been a constant stream of fights, force, and cell extractions. 5 years is a long time to roll the dice, but I finally came up on snake eyes. We were going in to break up a fight, something I got tasked to help with pretty often, and when I put one of the guys in an arm bar, he slipped and we both went down. Next thing I knew, I was on the floor of the bathroom with a shooting pain in my shoulder as I tried to breathe after my partner sprayed both combatants with OC. They pulled me out and got the situation under control, but I had definitely torn something in my rotator cuff. Couple hours at the ER, and the doc confirmed it. 2 weeks of bed rest, your arm in an isocast to take the strain off your shoulder. Then it's 90 days of mandatory light duty. Stragview didn't do light duty the same way other facilities did. I was told I could either ride a post for 3 months or work in the infirmary. I took the infirmary since it seemed less likely to result in me crashing a work truck into a ditch after falling asleep. Now, here I was, ready to get better fast so I could go back to running and gunning on the compound. First 4 hours, drugged by like a one-legged whore. I made sure the orderlies were doing what they were supposed to be doing, broke up a small shouting match between a couple of oldsters who both wanted to watch the TV, and discovered a paperback in the bottom drawer that looked pretty interesting. Turned out to be something from the Wheel of Time series, and I whiled away the hours as I tried to make the night go by as fast as possible. By 10 o'clock, I was ready to pound nails in with my forehead, and that was when my problem child in Cell 12 decided to wake up. I had looked in his folder before that, finding out his name was Victor Cruz. He was in for battery, and his file didn't show any of the usual earmarks for mental illness. Of course, living in this place would likely make you certifiable after a while. I was just glad he was quiet, something that seemed to be at an end. It started with some tossing and muttering. I kept an eye on him, but there's nothing to really write home about. He was having a bad dream or something. He was lying in a small nest of trash and blankets, his mat thrown into a corner as though he didn't trust it. He was naked as the day he was born, curled up like a rabbit in its den, and I could see the trash littering his cell floor. I wondered at the time why nobody cleaned his cell, the food on his wall looking equally as bad. But I'd find out soon enough. When he screamed like a banshee, I felt like I might slip out of my chair. I looked down the hall, hearing him yelling and thrashing around in the cell. I shook my head as I got up to see what the trouble was. Some of the old guys in the medical area had looked in that direction when he yelled, and a few of them shook their heads as I got up to go. They seemed to be telling me not to bother, to just let him yell himself out. But I knew if they checked the cameras and I'd just let him blow his lungs out without going to talk to him, I'd be in trouble. I arrived at the door, a big square of shatterproof glass with a handle and a food box attached, to find him going berserk in there. He was walking around, clutching his head and screaming for something to go away and leave him alone. He was looking at the corner of the cell and shouting at something that only he could see. I tried to get his attention, but he ignored me. He was shouting his lungs out, yelling his rage to the sky, but it seemed that he was unable to catch whatever it was. "Get down here and fight me! Get down here and fight me like a man!" he screamed. I tried to get his attention a few more times, but ultimately I just walked back to the desk and kept an eye on him between pages. He wasn't hurting himself, and wasn't really bothering me either. If he wanted to stomp around his cell all night and yell at ghosts, then that was his business, and I wasn't going to stand in his way. He went right on yelling for another hour before flopping onto the toilet and hanging his head in defeat. Figured he was probably out for a while, so I went back to my book. This was far from the last time I would hear from him. He would pick up again an hour later, and then an hour after that, and every performance would end with him sitting on the cold metal toilet as he huffed and puffed. I kept at it, trying to get through the night as best I could, and when Officer Dorrington came back and asked how it had gone, I told him it had been okay, other than Cruz. "Poor dude," he said with a little head shake. "You know, he didn't used to be that bad. He threatened to hurt himself, and somebody took him seriously, so they put him in cell 3. He's fine in there. He just tried to sleep for the remainder of his observation, but when the water main burst in the hall, we had to put him in cell 12. After that, he seemed to get worse by the day. His mental health really took a nosedive, and it's probably going to keep him back here for longer than expected." I nodded, only half listening, but kind of focusing on the last part of what Dorrington had said. "So how long has he been in room 12? Dorrington thought about it for a minute or two before shrugging. "Guess about 3 weeks, less than a month. They keep talking about letting him go, but he's come to the point where he may have to go to a psych camp." I took my leave after that, but I just couldn't get the idea out of my head. Had inmate Cruz always been crazy, or was it something to do with the room? I remembered his face as he looked for the source of the voices, and the way he kept looking into the corner made me wonder if there might be more to it than that. The next night was more of the same, but I knew it'd be the last night for a couple of days. I had to work this weekend, and I propped myself up with the knowledge that even if it was a really bad night, I'd have a couple of days off to look forward to. Dorrington said it had been a pretty quiet day, and that Cruz had taken a shot from a nurse around noon and would probably be asleep all night. I thanked him for the good news, my fist bump a little more enthusiastic this time, and settled in for a mostly quiet evening of reading and rounds. It lasted until about 3 o'clock, when another loud scream ushered in the start of the trouble. I looked up to find Cruz yelling at the wall again, as he jumped up to punch something just out of reach. I ignored him for a little while, but then I looked up to find him leaping off the toilet to get a higher punch, and I sighed as I marked my page and went to investigate. "Cruz!" I yelled, each jump resulting in a less graceful landing than the one before. "Stop it, before you hurt yourself." He ignored me, as I had been sure he would, and I repeated it another 2 times before grabbing for my radio to try to get some help. That's when he landed badly, and I heard his ankle snap through the door. My request for help became a little more frantic, and I looked back to find him still staring at the corner. His face was less angry now, and more fearful as he backed away on his butt and made for the door. That was good. It would mean that I could scoop him up when he got closer, but as I glanced back at the corner, I caught a brief glimpse of something that didn't make sense. It was a smoky face sitting midway up the wall, a grinning, demonic face that winked at me before disappearing completely. When help arrived, I was still looking for that face, but I straightened up as they got in position to grab him. He seemed almost thankful to be away from it, and we got him cuffed and had medical assess him. They determined that it was good and broke, and suggested he be sent to the hospital. So they packed him off to the ER, and I was short one crazy for the rest of my shift. It would have been nice to be rid of all that screaming, but with the cell empty, I started noticing other things. It was like there was a moth stuck in there, and I would see weird flashes of movement more often than I should. There was a weird whisper, too, a voice that I thought was the TV, but never seemed to have a source. It was always whispering at me like someone talking quietly in another room. And by the time my relief got there, a guy named Tinsdale, I was feeling more than a little rattled myself. I tried to put it out of my mind while I was off, but it was hard to shake. And after a few days off, I was almost glad to hear a familiar banging coming from cell 12 as I came back to work. Dorrington was at the desk, making notes on the clipboard, and when I mentioned that it sounded like Cruz was back from the hospital, he nodded. "Saw him on the way in, huh? Yeah, they put him in 3 when he came back. He's been quiet ever since, and seems like the hospital might have been good for him." I must have looked confused, because Dorrington handed me a folder with a picture of a different inmate on it. "This is Mathers. They brought him in Thursday after he did some light cutting in confinement. They say he started yelling at breakfast time, and he's just trying to fight thin air all day." I looked down and realized this was an inmate that I knew. Mathers was what we traditionally called a bug in corrections. He was in his early 20s and convinced that he was a real badass. He'd been in and out of confinement for everything from fighting to drugs, and he'd been taken out of my wing about a week before my accident. The report said that he had been cutting for attention, and mental health had decided that some time in a show cell might be good for him. It hadn't, but the wheels of justice are often slow to realize that your screams as you were ground under them were not the happy squeals of recovery. The whole shift, I kept looking between 3 and 12, the inhabitants a stark contrast between each other. Cruz now appeared to be the picture of calm. He did little beyond sit against the wall and read his Bible, looking around placidly whenever someone came near the door. He even waved at me a few times when I looked in on him during my rounds. And I wondered if he remembered being that screaming other that I had seen a few days ago. This was the Cruz that Dorrington had been lamenting, and I could see why. If you hadn't told me that he was the same man, I would have had no idea. Mathers, on the other hand, was far worse than I'd ever seen him. Mathers had always been a problem child, but his antics now were less that of a child seeking attention and more those of a mental patient. He had already thrown his food against the wall, and I noticed that most of it was in one particular corner. If you were looking through the door, it would have been the back left corner, the same one that Cruz had been shouting into a few nights ago. He would oscillate between sleeping, fitfully pacing around, mumbling, and yelling at things that only he could see, sometimes in a matter of seconds. Mathers got worse as the night progressed, but his anger was always targeted at that specific corner. When Dorrington arrived the next morning, I had more questions. Mathers hadn't been the only thing that I'd seen on camera in that cell last night. There had been a movement present that had drawn my eye several times. It looked more like a light reflection than a moth or anything, if you had watched it. Mathers followed it with his eyes, as if he could see it too, though. Once or twice I looked up in time to see something large and shadowy hovering in that corner, but it was always gone before I could study it much. Dorrington seemed interested when I wanted to ask him some questions, and he must have hoped that I'd found something interesting in the infirmary. "What's the story with Cell 12? I asked, getting right to the point. "What you mean?" "I mean, has anything ever happened in there? It seems like Mathers spent most of the night looking around and talking to something that only he could see, and I'm wondering if that's just normal for people in there. I didn't know Cruz, but I know Mathers, and that's abnormal behavior for him." Dorrington nodded slowly. "To be honest with you, I've only worked on the compound for a couple of months. I was pretty bad at it. I'm kind of a softie, but when they stuck me in here, I really took to it. I've spent most of my career in the infirmary, so I haven't really gotten a good feel for most of the inmates. What I have noticed is that people in Cell 12 seem to behave a little strangely. Like I said, I don't know them out on the compound real well, but now that you mention it, they don't seem very happy to be in there." I nodded, now pretty sure it wasn't just me. "So what's the story with Cell 12? "I don't know," Dorrington said, "but I have an idea who would. Let me ask some of the old-timers back here. Some of these guys have been here long enough to retire, if they'd been drawing a paycheck, and they've probably seen way more than either of us. I'll ask around and let you know something tonight." I wasn't sure how much stock I was willing to put in first-hand accounts by inmates, but I was interested to see what Dorrington would find out. When I came back that night, Dorrington pointed to a particularly old fella sitting in bed 7 and said that was my guy. I talked to him a little bit, but he said he'd prefer to tell you himself. I must have made a face because Dorrington gave me the first hard look I'd ever seen on the man. "He's not a leper. He knows what you're looking for, and he only wants a little bit of your time to tell you." "Can't you just tell me?" I asked, really not wanting to play inmate games tonight. "I could, but I won't. If you want to know so bad, then go to ask him. Otherwise, I guess you'll just never know." He left after that, looking like I'd insulted him somehow. Dorrington and I were on opposite ends of the spectrum. He was one of those guys who thought his charges were real people, but I'd always kept a healthy distance from the animals. I would ask them things, and sometimes I would even believe the information they gave me, but I always took everything I was told by these guys with a grain of salt. Most of them would lie to you if they thought it would get them something, but it was a little different back here. Most of them had everything they wanted. When they were in medical, they had plenty to eat, reliable heat and AC, a bed with relatively safe expectations of not being murdered or assaulted in their sleep. And as the night went on, and I listened to the banging from Cell 12, it only heightened my curiosity. As it crept closer to master roster count, I finally decided to go and talk to the old-timer and see what he knew. The old man's name was Williamson, and his chart said that he was 98. Inmates in their 90s are as rare as inmates off medication, and Williamson was likely an endangered species in a place like this. He had come to medical about 10 years ago after a stroke had taken most of his mobility, and it was probably the only reason that he hadn't died of a cold or after smarting off to one of these young Turks out here. He was awake when I came out onto the floor, and he raised his hand slowly as he shook it at me. He knew why I was there, most of them probably did, and as I took a seat next to him, I was surprised to find that he didn't hold that medicine smell or the smell of barely contained filth that a lot of them do. Most mobile inmates aren't particularly clean, but this fella smelled downright sociable. "Took you long enough. I was just about to drift off again. Once my medication hits in about an hour, there won't be much use asking Grandpa for a story." I took a look at his cataract old eyes to see if he was senile or just poking fun at me, and decided it was the latter. I told him to tell me about room 12, if he actually knew anything about it, that was. He smiled as if we both knew that he did, and got comfortable against his pillows. "Oh, more than some," he boasted. "Been back here on and off since I was 65. Been living in Stragview for most of my life, and I've seen and done things that would turn your hair as white as mine. I'm in here for murdering my wife and my brother, whom I found in bed together. Judge wanted to go easy on me, but my brother's wife said there was evidence that I had known before catching him in the act. I hadn't, but my brother seemed to think I did. She brought out his journal talking about how I had known and even been okay with it, but whether it was a lie or just delusion on his part, who's to say? I've got a round to do in about 30 minutes, old-timer. I'm here to hear about Cell 12, not your life story. The old man snorted. Well, too bad. You want to hear what I have to say, then you'll hear it on my terms. I'd stop interrupting if I were you. That nurse gave me my pills about an hour ago, and I've only got about 30 minutes before they kick in, and I'm comatose. I wanted to get mad, but it was the old guy's story, I guess, and I just had to let him tell it. Told him to tell it, and he went on. I was 28 when I caught my wife and my brother together, so been in Stragview for 70 years, I guess. In that time, I've seen a lot, and part of it was while I was an orderly here in the infirmary. I was looking 50 right in the face and decided it might be time to slow down a little bit. I'd worked just about every job in the prison, but the infirmary seemed like a nice little rest before somebody stuck a knife in me. I was making hooch and selling what inmates here call weed, and it was only a matter of time before my competition got tired of my meddling and decided to put me out of business. I'd worked at the hospital before getting arrested, and mopping floors and changing bedpans was not work I was unfamiliar with. So I spent about 10 years wiping asses and emptying catheter bags and keeping the place tidy. It was 1984 when they wheeled the fella in. He was about the worst looking mother I had ever seen. They had him in restraints with a spit mask covering his face and a man on each arm. He's bald as an egg and his head was covered in tattoos. Not the usual tattoos you see on bald white guys, but symbols and weird words. It was all stuff that a wizard might need for spells, and he looked like whatever he was casting with those symbols wasn't good for much of anybody. They put him in cell 12 and told the officer sitting in the booth to keep an eye on him. They said his name was Malik O'Dare, and he was spending 5 days in Stragview until a detachment from Macklemore could come to pick him up. Macklemore used to be one of the largest medical prisons in the region, and they were getting ready to shove him in a little box and study him until he was dead. Then they'd probably dissect his brains so they could study him after he was dead too, but that was beyond my understanding. So, for 4 days and 4 nights, Malik made their lives a living hell. He would bite himself and draw on the walls in his own blood. He would try to grab anyone that he could lay hands on, and they quickly learned that he didn't get visits from medical or food in a regular tray. After his second meal at Stragview, all his food came in a bag, and the orders were that the bag not be sent in either. They dumped the food into the little box outside the cell. Then you close the top and open the inner gate, and if he decided to take it, well, that was on him. He tried to flood the cell twice, succeeded once, pissed and shit under the door often. Amidst all the chaos, he continued to draw the weird symbols on the wall in his blood. But since he wasn't bleeding bad enough to be sent out for psychiatric evaluation, and they knew that Macklemore was coming to get him Monday, he was allowed to continue. The drawing in his own blood was nothing next to the other stuff he was doing, and it went mostly unnoticed, for the most part. If he was drawing, he was quiet. Most of them thought it was nothing anyway. I asked one of the guards what he was here for, and they told me that the things Malik O'Dare was here for made my crimes look like stealing candy off of kitties. He'd been running some kind of cult over by Dahlonega, real Jim Jones type of deal. They got up to some pretty heinous things in the time they spent together. human sacrifice and cannibalism and stuff with kids I'd rather not talk about. The whole shebang. It was crowned by the plan for mass suicide, and fortunately, someone caught him in time. He was going to have all 50 of his followers kill themselves on the blood moon, but before he could, the feds came in and stopped him. He tried to off himself a few times while he was in jail, but the judge finally handed him a death sentence, and he was remanded into federal custody. He'd been in a federal institution for the last 5 years, in a little room by himself without a lot of human interaction. But McLemore had paid him a mint for the right to study him before the feds carried out his death sentence. The feds had agreed to give him a stay of execution for a while and let McLemore house and study him for the next 5 years. Whatever hell he raised, well, that was none of the feds' business. He yawned loudly, but covered it with the back of his hand. I better give you the abridged version, 'cause I'm going to be asleep before long. It appeared that Malik never had any intention of going to McLemore. Being in Stragview was his last chance to escape the system on his own terms. And boy, did he. On the 4th night, the day before they was gonna come get him, he started yelling and chanting loudly. This wasn't new. Inmates in the show cell usually yell a lot, but some of the stuff he was yelling wasn't the usual rambling nonsense you heard. I peeked in on him and saw that he was sitting in his floor with his legs in an Indian pose. He was chanting in a language that I'd never heard, and as he did, the things he had drawn on the wall were blinking and glowing. I tried to tell the guard, but he told me to get back to work and mind my own business. There wasn't much else to do but obey or get sent to confinement and lose my job, so I got back to work. I saw the same guard get up in a hurry about 2 hours later, round about midnight actually, and bang on the door of cell 12 as he called for Malik to get up. He got on the radio and called for help, and when help got there, they discovered that Malik was dead. Medical decided it had been a stroke, and he'd probably swallowed his tongue during the fit. McLemore never got a chance to study him while he was alive. There was a huge investigation by the feds into Stragview. Fortunately for Stragview, at least, they had cameras in the cell back then, too. They weren't as fancy as the ones they got now. Tapes had to be changed twice a shift, but they got most of what happened on video. It was decided that the prison was not at fault, but I think the guard at the time still got fired. Probably an ass-covering maneuver, but nothing else really came of it. After that, anyone else they put in that cell has claimed to see things and hear voices. They get crazy within a few days, and the longest I've ever seen someone hold out was a week. I have lain in this bed and listened to them go mad. Sometimes I can even hear the same voice I heard whispering those arcane words so long ago. He's still in there somehow. He's become in death what he always wanted to be in life. An agent of chaos. Maybe that's what he was praying for in whatever language he was speaking. Just the ability to torment as many people in death as he had in life. I guess we'll never know. The old guy yawned again, flapping his hands at me in dismissal. I'm tired now, son. Go on. Let an old man sleep. I've been sitting here thinking about that story for the last few hours. I have a friend who works in the control room, and when I called to ask him about an inmate named Malik O'Dare, he said that O'Dare was a bit of Stragview lore that a lot of people knew about. He had died here, but the story about his crimes and the nature of his death were something that people thought had been exaggerated. When I asked him if he died in a show cell here in medical, he said that that was true. He asked me why I was curious, and I lied and said it was something that an inmate had told me. Well, I guess it wasn't much of a lie. I've been watching the camera for cell 12 as I write in my notebook. That fluttering movement I told you about has become something different. It's like a swirl of smog, moving from corner to corner. And sometimes, a pair of bright pinpricks will look up at me from the depths of the gas. It's like he knows that I know what he is, and that knowledge means that he's taken notice of me. I can hear the whispers at my desk, especially when it's quiet, and if that's what the inmates are hearing in that cell, then I can understand why they go crazy. I'm not sure how long I can listen to those whispers, and seeing that strange face as it looks at me through the camera lens. I suppose maybe I'll be ready for a show cell soon too. Hopefully cell 12 isn't empty if they decide to hold me here until the psych ward can come and collect me. I'd thought these 90 days would be tough, but now it seems my career may not be the only thing I'm in danger of losing. You're still here. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's spooky tale. If you'd like a little bit more spooky in your life, why not click on one of the videos that appears at the end of our story? Or maybe head on over to one of our playlists where you can get your fill of spooky content. If you like your spooky a little more tactile, I've got a new book that's come out. If you'd like your own copy, there's a link below in the description where you can get your own copy of my spooky book. If you like what you see here on the channel and think you might like to support in a more monetized way, then why not come over to Patreon or become a member on YouTube? Speaking of, let's go ahead and thank our members now. Thanks to Civ Garstad and Unicorn Hollow for being our spooky ghost contributors. Thanks to Saikat, Lee Kendall, Janet, and Chris Kinsella for being our spooky skeleton tier contributors. And of course, thanks to Xaronan, Winter, Tyler Parker, Stephanie Carrington, Sarah ASMR, Hi Stacy, Emily Coltsfoot, and Cinnamon Fox, and Bella Lee for being our ghostly reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. As I said, if you'd like to have your name read out at the end of every episode that I make, and maybe get a little more, come on down to Patreon and sign up, or become a member on YouTube. Ghostly Reader tier contributors get a book anytime I write one, which is usually about twice a year. So, what are you waiting for? Come on down and give it a look. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.